Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I have a really powerful and shocking story for you that has left its mark not only on the American justice system, but on the hearts of many people around the world. If you're interested in true crime cases, if you like to think about the motives and circumstances of mysterious events, be sure to stay tuned, because today's episode will be about the Susan Wright case. You may have heard of this case before, no wonder. It came to public attention mostly because of its brutality, but also because of the unexpected twists and turns and questions that went unanswered for a long time. Susan Wright and her husband Jeff were the talk of the town in 2003, perhaps in every media outlet in Texas, and later throughout the United States. And if you're wondering how a seemingly ordinary household can turn into the scene of one of the most notorious murders in a single night, you've come to the right place. In today's video, we're going to walk through not only the crime itself, but also the background of this case. We'll focus on who Susan was, what kind of life she led, what her relationship with her husband was like, and what all could have led to such an extreme act. We'll talk about the fateful night of the murder and what the subsequent investigation was like. Together we will look at the trial, where many shocking details were revealed, and how the case divided the public into two camps. Why this case, you may ask? The answer is simple. Not only does it offer a gripping and profound story, but it also raises important issues such as domestic violence, the question of self-defense, the role of the media, and the public trial of both victims and perpetrators. It is a story that is not black and white, which is why it has sparked such heated debate. The aim of today's video is not just to shock or amuse, but more importantly to stimulate thought. I want to show you all the available information so that together we can ask the question, was Susan Wright a cold-blooded killer or a victim who saw no other way out? Before you form your own opinion, I will take you through the case step by step. If you like content like this, be sure to subscribe and like me, because you'll regularly find real-life stories on my channel that are just as fascinating as this one. And I'd love it if you let me know in the comments what you think about the Susan Wright case, or if you know of another case you'd like to hear about in a future episode. So let's do it. Get ready, because today you're going to be treated to a really powerful story that might change your perspective on what might be behind the closed doors of our everyday reality. Susan Wright was born and raised in Texas, in a classic small-town American family environment. She was not an extravagant personality, on the contrary. From childhood, she was rather quiet, shy, and sensitive. Her family was middle class, and Susan was brought up with traditional values of family, hard work, and trust in others. Her relatives later testified that even as a young girl she was kind, considerate, and always tried to get along with others. At school, she was not one of the top achievers, but neither was she one of the problem children. She was rather unobtrusive, never got into conflicts, and usually completed her homework on time. She enjoyed the company of other children, but was never one of the most popular ones. As a teenager, she was seen as a girl with a big heart, but never very outgoing or rebellious. After graduating from high school, she decided not to go to college. Instead, she began working, first as a waitress, then in several other positions that allowed her to be self-sufficient. Susan was very sensitive to relationships growing up, and always longed for harmony and love. Love and security played a vital role in her life, and she was willing to give up her own ambitions and dreams for others. Her friends described her as someone who would easily sacrifice herself for the good of others, which made her popular on the one hand, but vulnerable on the other. The love of her life, Jeff Wright, played a vital role in Susan's story. They met when Susan was very young, when she was working in a restaurant. Jeff was the exact opposite in her eyes, charismatic, gregarious, and actually quite expressive. People who knew him said he was the quintessential alpha male. He liked to have fun, was popular with his friends, and always had something to say. He worked as a salesman and spent a lot of time with friends or playing sports, especially boxing, which was his great passion. At first glance, Jeff seemed like the ideal partner who could protect and provide for his family. In Susan's eyes, he was a man who charmed her not only with his looks, but also with his energy and confidence. At the same time, it was obvious even then that Jeff was a strong personality who liked to keep things under control and could sometimes be too dominant. Jeff was the type of person who loved life to the fullest, whether it was work, play, or interpersonal relationships. Their relationship was very passionate at first, full of mutual attraction. Susan was fascinated by his strength, confidence, and the way he could handle himself in any situation. The people around them saw them as a beautiful couple who would go far together. Jeff often said of Susan that she was beautiful, kind, and that he was trying to be the best man for her. Family and friends described Jeff as a man who loved to show off, but could also be generous and giving to his wife. After getting married, Susan and Jeff decided to settle down in a quiet neighborhood in Houston where they started a family. At first glance, their life together seemed very ordinary, even idyllic. Susan devoted herself full-time to housework, and later to motherhood. She was a model mother who made sure that her children had everything they needed and that the home was welcoming and safe. Jeff was the earner in the family and Susan was the support in the home. From the outside, they seemed to have it all: a house, children, a stable background. Susan was the one who made sure the house was always tidy, hot food on the table, and the kids were happy. Friends often said that Susan was a very caring and nurturing mom who gave her family her all. She was also a model wife who supported Jeff in his career and hobbies. Together they did the classic family activities, spending weekends in the garden, going for walks, going on vacations together, and celebrating all the important family events. Susan took great pride in making the home a safe haven where everyone felt comfortable. She always tried to find a compromise to make it peaceful and comfortable. In return, Jeff often brought home gifts, especially after successful days at work, or just to make Susan happy. The children were an absolute priority for Susan. She devoted most of her time to them and tried to make sure they had a good childhood. She was a typical mom who carefully planned family gatherings, attended school events, and invented different games for her children in her spare time. People in the neighborhood perceived her as a woman who was obsessed with the household. Everything had to be perfect and ready on time. Now let's look at how Susan and her family were seen by the neighborhood. To the neighbors, Susan was always kind and smiling, greeted everyone and never complained. She was very polite and helpful. If someone needed babysitting or help with groceries, Susan was always ready to oblige. People respected her as a caring mother and wife, and often held her up as a model of peaceful family life. She was known for always appearing well-groomed and friendly on the street, willing to say a few words or offer help. The neighborhood felt that their family functioned without much trouble. Jeff came across as a caring and proud father, who liked to boast about his children's accomplishments. Everyone knew their home as a place that was always clean, tidy, and quiet, which was mostly to Susan's credit. Although she was rather quiet, she managed to gain respect for her honesty and reliability. If someone needed advice or a little help, they often turned to her. Susan was never the center of attention, rather she kept to the background and concentrated on her family life. To those around her, she was the good neighbor who never meddled in other people's business but was always willing to help when needed. No one remembered her ever causing any conflict or arguing with anyone. She was very reserved in public, never acting eccentric or arrogant. Her family seemed ideal at first glance, leading many neighbors to believe that Susan lived a quiet and happy life. Even those who did not speak to them often felt that Susan was a woman to be trusted. Her reputation was unblemished and her neighbors respected her. In the eyes of those around her then, Susan Wright personified calm, caring, and devotion to her family. She was seen as a woman who could create a comfortable home, take care of her loved ones, and live a life without unnecessary conflict. It was this character that was one of the reasons why the later developments in her story were so incomprehensible and shocking to many people. This whole tragic act took place in the city of Houston, which is the fourth largest city in the United States and is located in Texas. It was a quiet neighborhood where Susan and Jeff Wright chose to live and raise their children. The fateful night that I am discussing today was Tuesday, January 14, 2003. It is important to remember that by this time the holidays were over. The beginning of January in America is usually associated with a return to the work pace and daily routine. It was on this ordinary January evening that something was about to happen that shocked not only their loved ones, but the public as well. The house where the murder took place was a typical single-story house with a small garden and a wooden fence. Inside the house, there was the usual atmosphere you would expect in a young family. There was no indication that something so terrible would happen here. According to later reconstructions and witness accounts, the evening of the 14th of January in the year 2003 was at first perfectly ordinary. Susan and Jeff were at home, and their children were asleep in their rooms. According to Susan's later account, she was trying to create a romantic atmosphere that evening, ostensibly to reconcile after previous disagreements. She decided to light candles and offered Jeff a massage, which she said was not unusual in their relationship. At this point in the story, we are well into the evening hours. Susan described that the bedroom was dimly lit, the candles were scented, and everything looked like the beginning of a quiet evening. According to her account, Jeff was lying on the bed, relaxed and showed no signs of suspicion, and it was here that the course of events changed completely. During this massage, and this is important to point out, Susan tied Jeff to the bed with scarves and sheets. In American homes, these are often commonplace items that no one would find suspicious. She said the restraints were meant to be part of a game, and Jeff had no reason to resist. The moment Jeff was restrained, Susan reached for the knife. This moment is absolutely pivotal to the case. Everything that followed, according to the testimony, was full of chaos, tension, and terror. Susan began stabbing her husband repeatedly. According to later analysis, Jeff had no chance to defend himself because he was tightly restrained. The room must have been completely silent, disturbed only by desperate screams and sobs. The bedroom, which only a few minutes before had seemed a place of peace, was transformed in a few minutes into the scene of an absolutely horrific act. All this took place at night, at a time when the whole house was asleep, and the children could not hear or see anything. One of the most shocking details of the case is the number of stab wounds Jeff Wright suffered that night. According to autopsy reports and expert analysis, his body was hit by over 190 wounds. Yes, you heard that right, over 190, a figure so extreme that it has become one of the main reasons why the case has been so intensely debated. Looking at the extent of the injuries, it's clear that the night must have been absolutely shocking and horrific. Such a number of stab wounds is very rare in criminal history, and most experts agree that the attack must have been conducted with great intensity and strong emotions. The blows were not only to the chest, but also to the back, arms, legs, and other parts of the body. Many of the wounds were superficial, but many were deep and fatal. This detail left a deep impression on both investigators and the public. It is common in criminalistics to encounter attacks that have perhaps 10 to 15 stab wounds, but more than 190 are truly exceptional and indicative of the extreme emotions or state of mind of the perpetrator during the crime. After the crime itself, Susan decided to try and cover up the whole incident. Her behavior in the hours that followed was very deliberate, though at the same time chaotic, as is often the case when one finds oneself in a totally unexpected and extreme situation. Susan seemed to be trying to cover her tracks while wondering how to explain Jeff's absence. The first step was to remove the physical evidence. Susan began to clean the bedroom, trying to cover up the traces of blood. She cleaned everything that was stained, including the sheets, mattress, and floor. The bedroom had become a place where efforts to cover up what had taken place were evident. Susan used cleaning products, rags and towels, which she then hid or threw away. She allegedly wrapped some of the bloody items in plastic bags. She then moved Jeff's body from the bedroom to the backyard. She began digging a shallow grave in the back of the property where she placed the body. This process must have been physically and mentally demanding. She worked at night when no one could see her and tried to be as quiet as possible. She did all these steps knowing that her children were sleeping in the house. Susan also wondered how she would respond to questions from the neighborhood about Jeff's absence. For several days after the murder, she tried to appear calm and normal, which included routine activities such as going to the store or interacting with neighbors. She made up all sorts of excuses and explanations. It is clear that at these times she must have been experiencing extreme stress and fear of discovery. The answer to the question of when the murder was discovered is fascinating precisely because Susan was able to keep what happened in their house a secret for several days. All the time she pretended that everything was fine, which was very confusing to those around her. The truth only came out a few days later when Jeff's disappearance was brought to the attention of his family and work colleagues. By the end of the second week of January in the year 2003, Jeff's friends and family were becoming uneasy because they had not heard from him, and this was very unusual for him. Susan tried to explain the situation with various stories, such as Jeff leaving the house or just being away temporarily for work. Eventually, however, the pressure of the environment intensified to the point where she had to admit that something was wrong. The crucial revelation came when the police were called to the house and investigators began searching the property. It was here, in the backyard, that they discovered Jeff Wright's body buried. This discovery immediately caused shock, and a major investigation was launched, which later yielded all the details we know today. Thus, the entire night of the murder has been permanently etched in the minds of not only the Texas CSIs, but of all who followed the story. It was a night when an ordinary Houston house became the site of one of the most talked-about murders of the new century. When someone goes missing, most people expect the police to immediately launch a manhunt. But in the case of Jeff Wright, it wasn't so straightforward. Although Jeff had been missing from work for several days, his disappearance at first seemed like something temporary with an apparently rational explanation. Susan claimed that Jeff had left for work or needed to rest, which was too simple and not very convincing an explanation for some of her friends and family. The first real suspicions began to grow when Jeff failed to show up for important appointments and began ignoring phone calls from loved ones. After all, Jeff was considered a reliable person. If he was really going to go somewhere, he would certainly let them know. So colleagues at work and his relatives began pressuring Susan to contact the police. However, Susan remained calm, seemed very reserved, and insisted that she needed to give Jeff space. When the police received the first tip about the disappearance, they initially approached the case with caution. It was not a typical disappearance. There were no signs of forced entry, the house was tidy, and it looked like Jeff might have actually left voluntarily. Still, the detectives sensed from the start that something was off. One of the first suspicious details was Susan's almost unusual attempt to appear calm and composed. Police officers are trained to notice subtle cues in people's behavior. They noticed that Susan would frequently change her statements, sometimes getting tangled up in details and mismatching time frames. Neighbors also testified that they had heard strange noises coming from the house a few days before the disappearance, which turned out to be an important detail. Susan did not report Jeff's disappearance until several days later, which in itself was startling. According to normal human logic, one would expect that if a partner did not return home, he or she would immediately become frightened and contact the police. Susan, however, delayed the notification. When she finally decided to contact the authorities, she struck the officers as cold, and her statement was very brief. During the interview, Susan tried to appear confident. She claimed that Jeff had left overnight without warning and that he had disappeared for short periods of time before. She told the officers that Jeff had been nervous for the past few days and that perhaps he needed time to himself. When asked for details, she often answered evasively or referred to Jeff's temper. The police, of course, recorded her every word and began to compare her story with what neighbors and family were saying. In particular, Jeff's mother and brother were skeptical from the beginning and distrustful of Susan's explanation. The police therefore began to investigate her alibi and her movements on the fateful days. During the interrogation, Susan appeared calm, confused, and sometimes even irritable. Investigators noticed that she became visibly nervous during some questions. For example, when asked about the evening Jeff disappeared or about possible arguments between the couple. The turning point in the entire investigation came when police obtained a warrant to search the house and its surroundings. This was due not only to Susan's vague testimony, but also to the suspicions that began to grow in the community and among Jeff's acquaintances. Detectives decided to focus on the yard and garden behind the house. During a careful search of the property, they found a spot in the garden with freshly dug soil. At first glance, it was an inconspicuous but suspicious detail. The officers began digging, and soon came upon Jeff Wright's body buried only a few dozen centimeters below the surface. The discovery of the body was a huge shock to investigators, as it was to everyone who knew Jeff. Forensic teams were immediately called in to secure the scene and begin collecting evidence. A number of physical clues were found, such as blood residue, body movement marks, and other microscopic evidence. Based on the discovery of the body and the preliminary results from the crime scene, it was clear that Jeff did not disappear voluntarily. Detectives began intensively questioning Susan, who at that point became the focus of attention as the prime suspect. After the discovery of the body, it was time for investigators to begin to intensely unravel the motive, that is, the reason why such a crime would occur. It was clear at that point that this was not an accidental disappearance, but a deliberate and very brutal crime. The police began to analyze the relationships in the Wright household, looking for possible debts, problems, or conflicts. Investigators began to untangle a web of relationships, statements from neighbors, family, and friends. They inquired about the domestic atmosphere, possible arguments, the mental state of both spouses, and their financial situation. They found that there was probably tension in the household that could have escalated into something much worse. Police analyzed not only physical evidence from the crime scene but also cell phone messages, emails, and other electronic communications. Investigators' suspicions fell along several lines. Could this have been a long-standing dysfunctional relationship where tensions and unresolved conflicts led to tragedy? Or was the motive entirely different, financial, jealousy, a desire for control over property, for example? The detectives tried to find answers not only in Susan and Jeff's past, but also in their everyday behavior just before the crime. During Susan's next interview, her statements became even more contradictory. Investigators noticed that her descriptions of events changed depending on the questions they asked. They began to confront her with evidence such as the times she was active in the house, traces of blood, or the testimony of neighbors who heard suspicious noises. Eventually, Susan Wright was arrested in her own home. Officers took her into custody and began preparing documents for further court proceedings. The whole arrest process was very emotional. Susan seemed confused and frightened, crying for a while, refusing to testify. The moment when Susan was taken away from her house in a police car was one of the most powerful moments of the whole investigation, and it shook not only her family but the whole community. The investigation and arrest of Susan Wright was a complex process that relied on many small details, investigative expertise, and forensic findings. It was through the meticulous work of the police and the consistent unraveling of the story that the truth of what really happened in the Wright home in January of 2003 was uncovered. The trial was held in a Houston courtroom where members of the media, the curious public, and, of course, family and friends of both sides gathered. The jury selection itself was very challenging. Attorneys for both sides tried to select unbiased people who would be able to judge the case objectively, despite its enormous media notoriety. The proceedings began with opening statements. Both the prosecutor and the defense attorney, Susan Wright, presented their version of events. The whole trial was extremely emotional from the start. The public and the media waited for each new piece of evidence and testimony, as the case had long attracted attention not only for the brutality of the crime, but also for the mystery surrounding Susan's motive and personality. Throughout the trial, witness statements from neighbors, friends, family members, doctors, and forensic laboratory experts were interspersed. Each side had the opportunity to question and contradict the other's evidence. The judge often had to calm the atmosphere, as some moments were indeed fraught with tension, especially during the presentation of crime scene photos or during questioning where details of the Wrights' family life surfaced. The trial lasted several weeks, as hundreds of pieces of evidence had to be reviewed, dozens of witnesses interviewed, and both sides allowed to present their side of the story in as much detail as possible. Each day was different, sometimes full of emotion, sometimes full of expert testimony to give the jury a closer look at what may have taken place within the closed walls of the Wright home. Defense strategy, led by an experienced attorney, played a key role throughout the trial. The defense chose to build its line on the assertion that Susan was the victim of years of domestic violence and that she acted in extreme distress, i.e., self-defense, on the night of the crime. Susan testified during the trial that her husband was often aggressive, mentally and physically abusive, and she lived in constant fear. According to her testimony, Jeff repeatedly behaved explosively, sometimes allegedly hitting, insulting, and humiliating her. The defense brought several witnesses to trial to confirm that Susan was often seen with bruise marks or that she confided in loved ones about her fears. Records of doctor visits for various injuries were also presented. One significant moment was the reading of Susan's diary entries where she described her fears and feelings of helplessness. Defense counsel argued that on the fateful night, Susan was so frightened that in a state of extreme psychological distress, she resorted to extreme measures. She also argued that there was an atmosphere of fear and manipulation in the household, which may have led Susan to act in a short-sighted manner. The defense also admitted that the act was very brutal, but stressed that in such extreme situations, victims of domestic violence often act irrationally, in a rush of fear and adrenaline. Susan's lawyer pointed out that the scale of the attack was evidence of her desperation, not cold-bloodedness. She tried to convince the jury that Susan needed protection, not the harshest punishment. This line of argument also presented the expert opinions of psychologists who described the so-called battered woman syndrome, a condition in which a victim who has been abused for a long time ceases to see an escape and reacts violently in effect. The defense counsel wanted the jury to see Susan as a victim of the system who had cried out for help for a long time and had not been heard. The defense was opposed by the prosecution, which in turn argued that Susan Wright acted with deliberation and in cold blood. According to the prosecutor, it was not a short circuit, but a pre-planned act to get rid of her husband and gain control of her property and children. The prosecution emphasized several key points. First of all, it was the number of stab wounds, more than 190, which, according to them, could not be explained as acting in effect. They argued that such a brutal attack lasts for long minutes and requires a repeated decision to attack, not a single lunge in self-defense. The prosecution also pointed out that Jeff was handcuffed during the attack and could not defend himself, which in the eyes of the prosecution precluded an imminent threat to Susan. Another key argument was Susan's attempt to cover up the crime. The prosecutor played photographs of the crime scene for the jury, showing how Susan cleaned up the blood, moved the body, and lied to family, friends, and police for days. The prosecution argued that these actions showed premeditation and an attempt to escape punishment. The prosecution brought forensic experts to court who described the victim's injuries in detail and insisted that the attack could not have been the work of momentary effect. Also presented were electronic communications that the state said showed Susan was not in fear for her life but was planning to get rid of her husband. Finally, the prosecution disputed the reported domestic violence. They emphasized that there was no direct evidence that Jeff had ever seriously harmed Susan, and that the descriptions of abuse were based primarily on her testimony and subjective feelings, not objective facts. One of the most powerful moments of the whole trial was the unique reconstruction of the murder right in the courtroom. During her presentation, the prosecutor brought the actual bed, props, and dummy into the courtroom. In front of the jury and the media present, she demonstrated how she believed Susan had handcuffed her husband and how the various stages of the attack followed. This reenactment was very emotional. Many of those present made no secret of their emotion or shock when they saw how the victim was completely helpless at the time of the act. The prosecutor wanted the jury to realize how long the attack lasted and the feelings of helplessness and pain Jeff must have experienced. This scene has stayed in many people's minds as one of the most dramatic moments in Texas justice. Another significant moment was the expert testimony. Psychologists, doctors, and forensic experts helped the jury understand not only the physical consequences of the crime, but also Susan's possible psychological motives and condition at the time of the murder. The testimony was interspersed with tears, outrage, and expert debate. The trial was also accompanied by intense media attention. Reporters waited outside the courthouse, bringing new information every day, and the public was divided. Some saw Susan as a victim, others as a cold-blooded killer. The trial was not just a search for truth, but an emotional battle for human destiny and justice. As a result, the jury had a very difficult decision to make. The Susan Wright trial will thus forever go down in the history of American justice as one of the most debated and watched cases of its time. The jury that was to decide Susan Wright's guilt or innocence was under enormous pressure. It was clear to her that her decision would not only affect Susan herself, but would also affect the lives of her children, the family of the murdered Jeff, and indeed the entire Texas community which followed the case with unprecedented interest. The jurors were chosen after very careful selection and were a diverse group, men and women of different ages and backgrounds to ensure maximum objectivity. The actual jury deliberations began after many weeks of trial. Jurors received hundreds of pages of evidence, played recordings of court testimony, viewed crime scene photographs, and listened again to closing arguments from both sides. Discussion among the jurors was not easy because the case was multi-layered. On one side was the brutality of the crime and the apparent attempt to cover up the murder. On the other side was Susan's emotional defense and the topic of domestic violence, which was discussed by witnesses and experts. The jury deliberated for hours. There were voices that wanted to take into account the defense's claims of long-term fear and psychological pressure, but other voices considered the act so extreme that it could not have been a desperate cry from the victim, but rather a premeditated act. In the end, the jury reached the decision it announced after spending a full day locked in the courtroom during deliberations. The announcement of the verdict was accompanied by a tense silence in the courtroom. The judge asked Susan to rise and then read the jury's verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. This verdict meant that the jury did not find that all the elements of first-degree murder, i.e. premeditated and premeditated murder, had been met, but it also found that the crime was serious, committed deliberately and with clear knowledge of the consequences. Following the announcement of the jury's decision, the sentencing phase followed. The judge listened to the recommendations of both sides. The prosecution asked for the highest possible sentence, i.e. life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, while the defense asked for the lowest possible sentence, citing the circumstances that led Susan to commit the crime. The judge considered all the evidence, the arguments put forward, and the recommendations, and decided to impose a sentence which, in his words, should be sufficiently deterrent, but at the same time reflect the complexity and uniqueness of the case. In the end, he sentenced Susan Wright to 25 years imprisonment with the possibility of parole after a certain part of the sentence. The sentencing itself was very emotional. Susan cried during the sentencing, her lawyer held her hand, and the quiet sobs of family members could be heard in the courtroom. Sitting opposite each other were relatives of the murdered Jeff, mostly in tears and feeling that the sentence was too light, and on the other side were Susan's friends who believed the sentence was too harsh given the circumstances. A sentence of 25 years in prison is one of the highest that can be imposed for second-degree murder in Texas, especially when the crime is accompanied by extreme brutality and a subsequent attempt to cover the trail. At the same time, it is not absolute, which meant that Susan could hope for the possibility of parole if she met the conditions and her conduct in prison was untroubled. The public reaction was virtually immediate and very divided. There were articles, commentaries, radio debates, and special television programs devoted specifically to Susan Wright in Houston newspapers and in the national media. Some people felt the sentence was too light in light of the unprecedented brutality of the crime, and believed Susan should have been given life in prison. Others, on the other hand, argued that the justice system had finally taken the domestic violence factor into account, and for the first time in a long time, heard the voice of the battered woman. Some journalists and commentators wrote about how the case exposed deep divisions in Texas society, with the conservative part of the public calling for maximum punishment, while liberal-minded groups emphasized the importance of psychological and social factors. In the days following the verdict, heated discussions on social media flared up. Groups were created in support of Susan Wright, as well as petitions calling for harsher punishment. The reaction of the family of the murdered Jeff also attracted attention. His mother and siblings took to the media to express their outrage, pain, and disapproval of the sentence. They argued that justice had not been fully served because, in their view, Susan's act was not just a result of fear but a premeditated murder. On the other hand, psychologists and domestic violence experts considered the sentence to be a turning point and saw it as a certain signal that the justice system was able to distinguish between classic murder and cases where the perpetrators were subjected to long-term psychological and physical abuse. Following the verdict, efforts to revise the sentence were launched. Susan's defense requested a retrial, arguing that some important evidence had not been sufficiently taken into account in the original trial. According to the lawyer, the circumstances of the domestic violence should have been more strongly taken into account, which in her opinion had a major impact on Susan's psychological state at the time of the crime. The higher courts eventually accepted some of the arguments. After several years, the sentence was reviewed and reduced by several years, giving Susan a chance for early release for good behavior. This move again sparked public debate, and not everyone agreed with it. Parole application hearings were held in front of the media and the public, making the case a long-standing symbol of the complexity of the American justice system. The legal steps included analyzing the testimony of experts and psychiatrists who confirmed that Susan suffered from battered woman syndrome. While the sentence was not completely overturned, its reduction showed that courts can reflect new realities and take into account the complexity of human behavior. The verdict and sentencing phase of Susan Wright's case is a fascinating look at how complex, multi-layered, and emotionally challenging the search for justice can be. It is a part of the story that raises questions not only about guilt and punishment, but also about human empathy, justice, and the courage to re-evaluate decisions made in light of new circumstances. One of the strongest themes that emerged around the Susan Wright case was the issue of domestic violence, whether real or perceived. The public debate has been extremely heated because the question of whether and to what extent Susan was really abused has never been clearly confirmed or refuted. Susan's supporters have often pointed out that cases of domestic violence are still difficult to prove today because victims rarely report abuse in a timely manner. Because they are afraid, ashamed, or have no support in the community, stories of women who had experienced similar situations emerged in the discussions, and many people saw Susan as a woman who could no longer bear the pain and fear. It was clear that for victims of domestic violence, Susan represented a symbol of despair and the last straw when one could see no other way out. On the other side were those who pointed out that allegations of domestic violence were never sufficiently supported by independent evidence. Some lawyers, columnists, and ordinary people argued that one cannot automatically accept every suspicion as truth, and that it is wrong to excuse extreme violence by alleging abuse when there is no clear evidence for it. At the same time, a debate has opened up about the place of victim psychology in American society and whether the courts can fairly distinguish between actual abuse and purposeful allegations. How testimony of this nature should be handled in court was also a big topic. Some women's organizations advocated for more use of psychological assessments and reliance on personal testimony in proving domestic violence, while some members of the public called for the principle of presumption of innocence to be maintained for victims of domestic violence. Thus, the general discussion around domestic violence moved the Susan Wright case far beyond a single family drama. It became a precedent upon which the moral and legal attitudes of an entire society were refracted on the question of what a victim's right to defend herself was, and when her response was no longer justified. From the very beginning, the Susan Wright case was one of the most publicized cases of its period. In the first weeks after the murder was discovered, it was covered by regional newspapers in Texas and the national press, and later it appeared in almost every major news report. Reporters waited outside the courthouse, bringing in interviews with experts, neighbors, family members, and even psychologists who dissected Susan's motives and psychology. NBC, CBS, and ABC television stations aired special reports that often took over the dramatic visuals of the case. Some shows such as 48 Hours and Dateline even did reenactments of the night of the murder and featured interviews with people who knew Susan. During the trial, a television camera was often present in the courtroom, allowing the public to watch the proceedings almost live. The popularity of the case led to documentaries and later feature films. One of the most famous TV movies inspired by the case is called Blue-Eyed Butcher and was broadcast by Lifetime. This film has become the subject of further debates about how the media influences the perception of reality and how Susan is presented in the public eye as either a victim or a calculated killer. The media often worked with strong headlines, emotional photographs, and edited accounts affecting the perception of the case for those who only watched snippets of information. Some articles emphasized the domestic violence motive, while others emphasized the brutality of the crime. The tabloid media also stepped in, seeking sensationalism and creating a femme fatale image around Susan. It was debated whether it was right for the media to make a show of such cases and whether this was damaging both to the victim and to a fair trial. The influence of the media was so strong that some lawyers and communication experts later analyzed to what extent Susan was able to get a fair and objective trial when most of the public was already clear about her fate according to TV and press reports. Perhaps the most significant controversy to emerge from the case, and one that has long persisted, was the radical division of the public into two very different camps. Both groups had their own strong arguments and often had very heated debates, not only on social media, in discussion forums, but also in ordinary families across Texas and indeed across America. The first group, often referred to as Susan advocates, insisted that Susan was acting in extreme distress, had been abused for a long time, and her actions were the result of desperation, not malice. These people saw her as a symbol of a woman who had been overlooked by the system and who, when she had no other choice, had resorted to violence as a last resort. They argued that society often turns a blind eye to domestic violence, and that Susan is actually the voice of all those who are afraid or unable to speak up. The second group, which I might call Susan's critics, saw her act as a brutal, cold-blooded, and merciless murder. In their eyes, this was a woman who had planned her act, set everything up to minimize the risk of detection, and then tried to cover her tracks and lie to the police and those around her. These people argued that it was impossible to condone such a level of violence without clear evidence of the existence of abuse, and that the punishment should be maximum. The division of public opinion was also reflected in cultural life. Petitions were created in support of Susan, as well as petitions demanding harsher punishment. Blogs, podcasts, and even amateur documentaries were circulating on the internet, discussing every detail of the case. Some women called Susan a hero, others a monster. There were even groups raising money for legal aid, while another section of the public wrote letters asking for a life sentence. This division mirrored deep themes in American society: the question of where the right to defend oneself ends and guilt begins, the role of the media, how to treat victims of domestic violence, and where the line between justice and retribution lies. Overall, the phase of controversy and public reaction to the Susan Wright case is a rare glimpse into how complex and multi-layered the search for truth can be when it is not just about facts, but about the emotions, experiences, and values of an entire society. This case became not only a courtroom drama, but also a mirror of a society where each side sought its truth, and often found it elsewhere than the other. The Susan Wright case has become one of the most debated topics in domestic violence in the American legal and social landscape of the early new millennium. In the months and years after the story was publicized, many domestic violence victim advocacy organizations began to use the case as an example of how victims can act desperately and tragically in the most extreme cases when they have long lacked effective help. Susan's story has sparked a national debate about how the courts approach allegations of psychological or physical abuse. A number of lawyers, judges, and social workers have questioned whether the current system provides sufficient protection for victims and whether it can recognize when a woman, man, or child is genuinely in danger. Conferences and expert debates were held, using Susan as a case study on the importance of noticing subtle signals and not taking domestic violence lightly. At the same time, the case led to increased interest in the issue of battered woman syndrome and its recognition in judicial practice. The psychological side of criminal law has moved to the forefront, as experts have increasingly pointed out that victims of domestic violence often do not act rationally, and their reactions tend to be extreme precisely because of long-term stress, isolation, and fear. Some states have begun to adjust their trial methodologies to take into account the possibility of psychological breakdown in victims, and in several cases judges have instructed juries to take this aspect into account when deciding on guilt and punishment. On the other hand, the case also showed the limits of the American justice system. Critics among lawyers, some journalists, and conservative commentators have stressed that not every accusation of domestic violence can be accepted automatically as an excuse for murder. The debate shifted to the question of how to properly investigate domestic relations, how to verify statements, and how to guarantee justice for both parties, the victim and the alleged perpetrator. Thus, the long-term impact of the case was to raise awareness of the importance of preventing domestic violence, expand counseling services, and change the approach of the police in investigating family conflicts. Legislators in some states have also re-evaluated rules for issuing protection orders and training police officers in domestic violence. The Susan Wright case has inspired many works of art, documentary programs, and books. Filmmakers, writers, and television show creators have been fascinated not only by the case itself, but especially by its psychological depth and issues of guilt, victimhood, gender, and justice. One of the most famous television treatments is the Lifetime movie Blue-Eyed Butcher. This feature film captured not only the act itself, but also the emotions, inner struggle, and complexity of the situation Susan found herself in. Starring well-known actresses, the film became very popular, sparking another wave of discussion and analysis of the case from both a psychological and moral perspective. Similarly, several documentary programs, such as 48 Hours, Snapped, and Deadly Women, have analyzed the Susan Wright case from different angles. They often focused on how the media influenced the public's view, what the flaws or strengths were at different stages of the investigation and trial, and what the role of gender stereotypes was in the perception of women as perpetrators of such a brutal act. The publishers also offered readers several books, the most famous of which is Wifey from Suburbia to Murder by author Lisa Pulitzer. The book and a number of magazine articles discuss not only the facts, but also Susan's emotions and inner world in the context of her decisions. This gives readers and viewers a chance to experience all sides of the story, not just the forensic facts but the human side of the drama. Susan Wright's case has even made its way into law, psychology, and sociology textbooks, serving as an example of the complexity of family tragedies and the failures of a range of institutions. Children and young people learn about it in media literacy courses, where it is discussed how the media work with such sensationalism and what effect it has on public opinion. Susan Wright's life after her conviction has been and continues to be the subject of great interest, not only to the media, but also to the public and experts on the penal system and the psychology of convicts. After her sentencing, Susan began serving her sentence in a Texas women's prison, where she was supervised by both social workers and psychologists. Due to the nature of the crime and the media publicity, her situation was extremely difficult, with some female inmates seeing her as the famous one on TV, and others refusing to communicate with her. Susan became the object of increased surveillance in prison, participated in therapy for victims of domestic violence, and according to some reports, worked in the library or in a sewing shop. Many domestic violence victim protection organizations contacted her to offer psychological support and legal assistance, and some volunteers sent her letters of support or shared their own similar experiences. At the same time, Susan was in contact with her children for a long time when possible. Her family relationships suffered major ruptures, but some sources indicate that her children visited her as much as prison rules allowed. Susan reportedly tried to help other incarcerated women who had a history of abuse or mistreatment. Susan's interviews, which she gave through letters or short phone calls, were also in the public domain. In them, she often spoke of regret, of wishing she had been able to ask for help sooner, and of the pain her actions had caused not only to Jeff's family but also to her children and herself. Some of these accounts have served as sources for journalists and book authors to do deeper psychological profiling of a woman who, out of desperation, found herself in such an extreme situation. After several years in prison, the legal system reviewed the sentence. Experts reassessed the effect the alleged domestic violence had on Susan's psyche and whether the original sentence had sufficiently taken into account all the new information. As a result, her sentence was reduced, and she was able to apply for parole after a certain part of her sentence had expired. Susan took advantage of this opportunity and was released on parole after approximately 20 years in prison. Susan is currently living in anonymity, reportedly under an assumed name, outside of Houston. She avoids the media and public attention, reportedly works a regular job, and is trying to rebuild relationships with her children. The public knows only the minimum about her life, and Susan herself has stated that her main wish is for peace, so that she can stay in contact with her family and live a new life free from the shadows of the past. Today, Susan Wright is more of a symbol than a public figure for most of society. Her name appears in debates about domestic violence, legal reforms, and the media, but she tries to stay out of the public eye. Only sketchy information about her life is circulating. Some say she is involved in volunteer activities, others say she lives a very private and quiet life. Several journalistic teams have tried to get an interview with her, but Susan has refused. Reports about her health, work life, and family situation are not publicly available because her lawyers have ensured that she is protected from further media interest. Susan Wright's children are now grown up and, according to some sources, are seeing their mother, although the relationship has never been easy. In Texas domestic violence victim advocacy organizations, her case continues to be studied as an extreme but instructive example. Students of law, psychology, or sociology often return to the issues raised by Susan Wright's case, whether it is the battered woman syndrome, the influence of the media on the judicial process, or the limits of justice, in cases where the line between guilt and victim is very blurred. In conclusion, the Susan Wright case remains not only a powerful warning but also a call for deeper empathy, understanding, and a search for better ways to prevent similar tragedies, whether it is through victim support, public education, or improving the functioning of the justice system and social services. It is a case that will forever be etched in American history, not only by its course, but more importantly by its impact and legacy. I will begin with a brief summary of the key facts that we have reviewed together throughout this narrative. From beginning to end, the entire Susan Wright case was extraordinary in its complexity, its emotion, and how deeply it divided the public. At the center of this story is a young woman whose life's journey changed profoundly overnight. Every detail that surfaced during the investigation and trial only added more layers of confusion and questions. It was important to know who Susan was. An ordinary woman, mother and wife who had long lived in the shadow of her relationship. Those around her perceived her as a quiet, caring, and dedicated person who never stood out. Then, when the tragic act occurred, not only were her friends and family shocked, but the entire Texas community was shocked. On a night that changed everything, an act of singular brutality took place that has subsequently been examined from every angle: physical, psychological, and legal. Police, investigators, the court, and the media have tried to unravel motives, searched for causes, examined relationships, and yet many question marks remain. The trial was an example of the clash of two different perspectives. On the one hand, there was the defense, which pointed to possible domestic violence and the desperation of a woman who could see no other way out. On the other hand, there was the prosecution, which demanded justice for the victim and stressed the cruelty and premeditation of the crime. The result was a jury verdict that had to decide between complex human fates, the law, and its own conscience. The verdict caused a wave of emotions and opened a society-wide debate on justice, victim perception, guilt, and the possibility of forgiveness. Inevitably, the whole case also became a media sensation and a symbol that transcended ordinary criminality and turned into a national debate about how we approach domestic tragedies and what can be hidden behind the closed doors of family homes. Susan Wright's story is a powerful statement about the human psyche, interpersonal relationships, but also about the importance of noticing weak signals and listening to those in difficult life situations. One of the main lessons we can take from her story is the need for an open dialogue about domestic violence. It is important to be able to recognize even subtle signs that someone in our neighborhood is suffering and to be prepared to offer help before tragedy strikes. At the same time, however, it is essential to remember the complexity of interpersonal relationships and the risk that reality may be much more complicated than it first appears. In Susan's story, it became clear that no clear distinction can be made between victim and perpetrator, and that behind every similar case there are decades of unseen tensions, unspoken pain, and failures of the environment and institutions. Another important message is the crucial role played by the media and public opinion. The Susan Wright case has shown that media portrayal can profoundly affect not only the public's view, but also the course of the investigation and trial itself. At a time when we are overwhelmed by information, it is therefore important to seek the truth in a wider context, to check the facts and not to be carried away by emotions or popular narratives. We should also never forget the children, who are often the biggest victims in such stories. Their lives are shaken to the core and they carry the consequences throughout their lives. It is our duty to think about how to protect the most vulnerable members of society and how to prevent such tragedies from happening again. Last but not least, we must remind ourselves that justice is not always simple and straightforward. Judicial decisions must take into account not only the facts, but also human circumstances and the possibility of redress. Forgiveness and understanding for the weakness of the other, as well as the consistent punishment of evil, are two sides of the same coin, and it is their balance that is the greatest challenge for any civilized society. In closing, I would like to ask you, my loyal viewers and listeners, an open-ended question, which I believe is the most fundamental one in the entire Susan Wright story. Where do you think the line is between justice and forgiveness? Do you think Susan Wright received a punishment that fits her guilt, or should her situation lead to more understanding and leniency? Try to think how you would react if you were in the shoes of a juror. Would it have been more important to you to punish the crime severely, or would you have given more consideration to Susan's history and mental state? And what role do you think the public should play in cases like this? Do we have the right to judge others based on media reports and half-truths, or should we try to understand things in depth and with respect for human complexity? Next, I would like to invite you to share your experiences or opinions in the comments. Do you know someone who has been in a difficult family situation? Do you think society is doing enough to prevent domestic violence? What do you think is the best way to support victims and prevent similar tragedies in the future? Your comments are extremely valuable to me because it is through them that we can work together to find answers to questions that have no easy solutions. Every opinion, every personal experience can help open the eyes of someone else who is facing similar problems. In the end, I would like to thank you all from the bottom of my heart for going through this difficult but important story with me. I know that the emotions that cases like this evoke can be very strong, sometimes evoking compassion, sometimes anger or confusion. Yet I believe that by sharing these stories, we are helping to create a better and more responsive society. If you like my content, I'd love it if you give this video a like, share it with friends, or give me a subscription. This gives me the power to film other topics that are meaningful. And if you have a tip for another story you'd be interested in, feel free to drop me a line. I'd be happy to cover it in the future. Thank you for being here with me. Remember that real stories are not black and white, and that even behind the greatest tragedy there are many human stories, pain, and the desire for forgiveness. If you ever find yourself in a difficult situation, don't hesitate to ask for help. Even one well-intentioned conversation can change the whole story. Have a wonderful time, take care of yourself and your loved ones, and remember, it's never too late to start over. I look forward to seeing you in the next video.